Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, everyone. I hope well. Definitely getting much more colder in the day, so everyone is ill. Health is good. Inshallah, we start in a very little bit, in maybe 3 minutes.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Seerah. Just starting in. It is so three. Okay, inshallah. Let's begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back to our weekly Seerah course that we are doing. Um, inshallah, we're going to continue on to the next chapter of the Seerah of the story of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But before we do that, let's quickly do a small recap of what we learned yesterday. So in the chat room, or you can also unmute your mics. That's not. My first question to you is: last week, we learned about the battle. So who can tell me why exactly, in simple terms, why the battle took place? It is a bit of a long question, but as simply as you can, either type or unmute your mics. Um, why did the battle actually take place? Anyone have any idea? Can remember? I'm sure someone remembers. Anyone have any idea why the battle other took place?
Sorry to interrupt. There was a camera open. It's closed now. Jazakallah.
Happens. So anyone know why the Battle of Badr took place? When I'm not going to take no for an someone must know in simple terms. Brilliant. Yes. So Rim is saying because Abu Sufyan took the Muslims' possessions. Yep, you're basically right. I'll give you that. Jazakallah khair, Rim, for um telling us all why the battle. So after the migration of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu and the Muslims to Medina, the Muslims left behind a lot of things back in Mecca. And you can imagine there were a lot of things that were left behind, and the Quraysh took all of these things. And Abu Sufyan had a caravan, and back in Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu time, a caravan, it's not what we know as a caravan, like you might go caravan site. That's not what a caravan is. A caravan is basically like um, a load of possessions, and it's being transported to somewhere where they can sell these possessions. That's what, if you hear the word caravan, that's what it means. So Abu Sufyan took a caravan of all the belongings of the Muslims, and he went out to go and sell these belongings. Now the Muslims heard that this caravan was going to pass through. So it wasn't going to pass through Medina, but they heard that this caravan was about to leave. So the Muslims set out and said, "We are going to take back our rightful belongings." And this small plan became almost like a huge battle because the Quraysh got news that the Muslims were going to attack the caravan. And so the Quraysh decided to organize a huge army, and then the Muslims decided to to organize a huge army, and then they fought. So quickly, tell me, who was victorious in the Battle of Badr? Was it the Muslims or was it the Quraysh?
The Muslims.
Yes, brilliant. Jazakallah khair, Naseem. It was indeed the Muslims were victorious in Battle of Badr, and they were a very small number of Muslims, only around coming in my head. I'm not going to say, I don't want to say a wrong number, but it was a very small number, and the Quraysh were around 1,000. So
330, sister?
330. It sounds it,
30.
Ifana.
Yes, 330.
330. Jazakallah khair, Ifana and Rim, 313 Muslims. And I believe the number of Quraysh were around 1,000. I might have that exact number wrong. Maybe you guys can correct me. But yes,
Yeah, yes, they were 1,000. Yeah.
they were around 1,000. Jazakallah khair. Yeah, brilliant. So with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Muslims were victorious. Now, following from this, although we don't, this is what we're going to cover today. Um, why do you think so? The Battle of Uhud is what we're going to cover today, right now. And it happened right after the Battle of Badr. What are some of the reasons why you think a second battle might take place here? What might the Quraysh be feeling towards, and why would that lead to another battle? Exactly, Shofar.
Eh,
Yeah, exactly. And I think Naseem, you were going to say the same thing. The Quraysh were feeling defeated, they were feeling humiliated, and a lot of their key people passed away in the Battle of Badr. So they're feeling this revenge and this animosity towards the Muslims that they were so confident they were going to defeat. in the Battle of Badr, but they did not. So this is the premise of why the Battle of Uhud actually took place. So only 1 year after the Battle of Badr, um, so the battle took place 1 year after the Battle of Badr, where the Muslims were victorious. So from Badr, the Muslims were victorious. Now, I told you that the main premise was that the Quraysh were very angry towards the Muslims. So a group of, and because all of the Quraysh were feeling such anger and such revenge towards the Muslims, they gathered a huge army to avenge their loss, and they set out to destroy the Muslim empire. So this was almost the Quraysh's final straw, that they said the Muslims are enough nuisance for us. We need to destroy them completely. Now, if you've ever been to Haram or you've ever been to Mecca, then you might have actually gone to Uhud. Now, Uhud is between Mecca and Medina, and it's very mountainous. It's a very mountainous area, and you can actually go on top of these mountains. And this is the plains of Uhud, as you can see here. This is quite a recent picture. So Abu Sufyan, who was one of the key players in the Battle of Uhud, formed this very, very huge army. And this army was a group of 3,000 men. And Battle of Uhud was quite interesting because there were also women that came along. And we'll discuss what the women's roles were in the Battle of Uhud. And so Abu Sufyan vowed to avenge the Muslims to restore Quraysh's pride. So they were an army of 3,000 men, and I don't think this number included women. Women were an extra. And they came with 200 horses, and the army was led by an army general, and you might know this name, Khalid bin Walid. So you might have heard this name because Khalid bin Walid actually did become Muslim. But at this particular moment, Khalid ibn Walid was not a Muslim, and he was still part of the Quraysh tribe. Now, the Muslims got word that the Quraysh were preparing this very, very big army. Now, the Muslims, along with the specific Jewish tribes within Medina, they all formed that they were gonna form an army, and they were gonna fight against the Quraysh. Now, so the Muslims are preparing their army, and the Quraysh have prepared their army, and they're on their way to defeat the Muslims. Now, again, one of the reasons for Uhud was that they wanted to avenge Muslims. Now, the wife of Abu Sufyan, her name was Hind, and she ordered a slave whose name was Wahshi to kill the Prophet's uncle, who was Hamza radiallahu anhu. His sole purpose, this slave's sole purpose, was to kill Hamza radiallahu anhu. And this is because Hind's father and her uncle and her brother, they all died in the Battle of Badr. So this is what Hind set out to do. Now, Wahshi was promised freedom if he was successful in killing Hamza radiallahu anhu. And this is what this slave set out to do. So when the Quraysh reached the Muslims, sorry, I missed a little bit. So I think I've forgotten to include it. So if we go back to the Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had a council with him when he found out the Quraysh were building an army to come and fight the Muslims. He needed to decide within his council whether he wanted to stay in Medina and fight in Medina, or if he wanted to go outside and fight not in Medina. Now, Muhammad ﷺ's preference was that he actually stayed in Medina. But the majority of his council decided, no, it will be best if we go outside of Medina and fight in Uhud. And because this was the majority, this was the most popular opinion. This is what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ went with. So he listened to his counsel and he was advised by his counsel. Yes, and this is this slide. So the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ sat down with his council and went to Uhud to fight. And there were around 1,000 Muslims to go and fight at Uhud. And there were some women that accompanied with them. And some of the most notable women were Aisha radiallahu anha and Barakah radiallahu anha. They accompanied them. So you might be thinking, why would women accompany the men to battle? Now, some of the roles of the women were things like first aid. So the woman would provide water and aid the men who might be injured. Another role of the women in Uhud was actually kind of like, you can almost say cheerleaders, in the sense they would sing songs and they would motivate the Quraysh to go and fight. And you see this in all types of cultures. There are, things like poems or different like drums you use to motivate the men to fight to their best extent. And this is exactly some of the rules for the women. Now, when the Muslims set out to go to Uhud to fight, they, like I said, they were accompanied by a lot of Jewish tribes who had, prior to Uhud and prior to Badr, had signed an agreement that they would take Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a leader and they would listen to him. So this is the pledge that they signed, or almost like the vow that they made to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, when they were on their way to Uhud, a leader of the Hazraj tribe, who was Abdullah ibn Ubay, he, within his group of people, this is midway while they were traveling, he told his people that we don't need to go and fight at Uhud. There is no reason for us to go fight. They told them, why are we spending all this money to go and fight with the Muslims? And they also Abdullah ibn Ubay convinced the group of people that they would lose, that they would not be victorious, or that they were not needed within the Muslim army. And because of this, around 300 people, along with Abdullah ibn Ubay, refused to actually go to Uhud, and they went back to Medina. Now, although it's quite difficult for us to understand, because our whole political system is quite different now, but imagine there's a leader and he has his army, and then one of the army generals plots against the leader. That's treason. And the army general that plotted against the leader can actually be persecuted and killed, because you're disobeying the army. And if the army is not obeyed, if the army does not obey the leader, then that's your whole security system down the drain. Now, this is exactly what happened. Abdullah ibn Ubay refused to obey the Prophet Muhammad and actually took back 300 people with him. So the Muslims were already down a number, because these 300 people, along with Abdullah ibn Ubay, left the Muslims alone. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this treason. Talks about this treason in the Quran, in Surah Al-Imran. And he says, and who are the hypocrites who, when it was said to them, come fight for God's cause, or at least defend yourselves, they answered, we would follow you if we knew there was going to be fighting. On that day, they were closer to disbelief than belief. They say with their tongues what is not in their hearts. God knows exactly what they conceal. In the next ayah, Allah says, as for those who stayed behind and said of their brothers, only if they had listened to us, they would not have been killed. Tell them, ward off death for yourselves if you say what is true. So kind of spoiled the end there a bit with adding the second ayah. But if we look at the first ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls this group of people out, and he calls them hypocrites, people that say one thing but then do the other. And it's quite interesting here because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says on that day they were closer to disbelief than belief. So these are Muslim people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not calling them out completely. He's not saying they're all a kafir. No, he's saying they're close to disbelief than belief. And what does that mean for us? That means that we can also be in scenarios and we might make decisions that brings us very close to disbelief, that we're almost on that boundary of disbelief. Yet there must be some people in the 300, in the group of 300 that left, that were not completely there. They were almost there, but they were persuaded by a leader who was a hypocrite. So it's something for us to remember that our decisions determine whether we're close to kufr or not. Now, so when the Muslims arrived at Uhud, they were there first. So they arrived at Uhud first, and I'm going to show you a picture soon. So Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam placed 50 archers on one of the hills near Uhud, and he told them not to leave their stations under any circumstance. So here is the image. So this is Uhud, and this is this mountain where the archers were. And the Muslims camped in this little, call it a cul-de-sac, if you will. And this was where the Muslim camp were, and this is where the Muslim armies were. So the archers were stationed here in case the Quraysh came around this end and went towards the Muslim camp. So the archers prevented anyone from coming around this end. And then the Quraysh camp was here. So what ended up happening was in the beginning of a battle, typically there's duels. So people go in and there's almost like 1-to-1. So some of the two people that went were Ali radiallahu anhu and Hamza radiallahu anhu, and they defeated their opponents in the duel. And then your battle starts. So the battle was going very well, and the Muslims were very strong, and they were able to almost like make the Quraysh. So if you go back to the army, they were almost at the Quraysh's campsite. So they're able to push the Quraysh very far behind. And the Muslims on the mountain, the archers, they were able to see this. And what happens in a war is there's loads of like weaponry, there are animals left behind. There's a lot of possessions that are left behind that the Muslims can then use to sell. So there's a lot of gains that you get from war. So when the archers saw that there were all these weapons and there were all these things to pick up, you can call it booty, they thought, we're winning and we've pretty much won. So let's come down from the mountain and let's try and collect all of this, because all of the Muslims are collecting the possessions that are left from war. Now, there are only a very few archers that said, no, the Prophet Muhammad has told us to stay here until we are explicitly told not to. But they did not listen, and the archers left their posts and went down to collect their booty. Now, when they went down to collect their booty, Khalid bin Walid actually saw that the archers were coming down. So what he did with a small group of people, he went, let's go back to the image, he went around the ditch, and a small group of Quraysh were able to come from the back of the Muslims. Now the Muslims are now sandwiched between two armies of the Quraysh. And this is what led to the massacre of many, many Muslims, because now they were sandwiched. And when the Quraysh saw that their people are coming from the end, they came and they started to fight again. So the Muslims had nowhere to go, and the only place they could go was near their camp. So a lot of Muslims actually went towards the camp, but then what happens? They're sandwiched again. There's nowhere to go. So this was an incredibly difficult time for the Muslims, where they were sandwiched with Quraysh from both sides. And at this moment, the Quraysh were very, very haughty, and because they had killed so many Muslims, they the fighting stopped, and and because a lot of the Muslims actually went on top of the mountain, and when that happens, you can't do much, you can't fight that much. So the Quraysh got very haughty and then returned back to Makkah, or returned back to their campsites. And the Prophet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this in Surah Al-Imran again, in ayah 157, and he says, God fulfilled his promise, and he's talking to the archers who left their posts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, God fulfilled his promise to you. You're rooting them with his permission, but you faltered, disputed the order, and disobeyed. Once he had brought you with sight of your goal. Some of you desire the gains of this world, and others desire the world to come. And then he prevented you from defeating them as a punishment. He has now forgiven you. God is gracious to the beloved. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the archers who disobeyed the order of the Prophet Muhammad. So let's talk about the Muslim casualties. So one of the most prominent Muslim casualties was Hamza radiallahu anhu, who was indeed killed by Wahshi. And because Hind was so she wanted to avenge the death of her family, she actually, with his body, she mutilated his body. And one of the things that she did is she took out his liver and bit it, which is it's an incredibly vile thing to think about. And within the process, the Prophet Muhammad was also very, very harshly injured, and he lost tooth and he was bleeding a lot. And within fighting, one of the rumors spread that the Prophet Muhammad had been killed. And this is also what led to a lot of the Muslims retreating back and not fighting on. And around 70 to 85 Muslims were martyred, and there were 40 that were injured. So now the battle has ended, and the Muslims, so a lot of people, they sort of say, oh, the Muslims were defeated. And I guess that is true, because the Muslims did not meet their target, but neither did the Quraysh. The Quraysh did not meet their target. The Quraysh's aim was to dismantle the Muslims completely, but they didn't, because they ended up going back home because they were so haughty with themselves. And that was the end of the battle of Uhud. Now, when the Muslims went back to Medina, and the Jewish tribes got word that a lot of Muslims had been killed, and the Quraysh were victorious against the Muslims. A lot of the Jewish tribes lost trust in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they were very, very close to trying to disobey the Prophet. And there was one tribe that actually did. So Banu Nadir, who was a Jewish tribe in Medina at the time, they actually plotted to kill the Prophet Muhammad right after they came back from Uhud. And one of the reasons for this is because they lost trust in him as a leader. And on top of this, they also did not like the concept of Islam. They did not want the Prophet to be a leader. And all this animosity was built, and Banu Nadir plotted to kill the Prophet. But through Allah's mercy, the Prophet Muhammad was saved. The Banu Nadir did not manage to kill the Prophet. However, because Banu Nadir and because all the Jewish tribes had signed a treaty to say that they would obey the Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet ordered the exile of Banu Nadir. So they said to Banu Nadir that you need to leave your houses, you need to leave from Medina, because you're not allowed to stay in Medina anymore. It's almost as if their passports were stripped away. Now, when they got word of this, that the Muslims are going to besiege them, what they ended up doing is they ended up packing their things and preparing to leave. But before they left, they actually ended up destroying their fields, their crops, their fortresses, their houses. With their own hands, the Banu Nadir destroyed all of their belongings. why? Oh, so I've written it here, so I can't ask that question. But the reason why the Banu Nadir destroyed their possessions is because they were so full of pride that they didn't want the Muslims to benefit from their possessions. They didn't want even the Muslims to benefit even a little bit. So that's why they went and they destroyed their possessions with their own hands. And after that, they migrated to Syria. And the Prophet, the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this as well in Surah, I believe this is Surah Hashr, Surah 59, Ayah 2. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "It was He who drove the people of the book who broke their faith out of their homes at the first gathering of forces. You believers never thought they would go, and they themselves thought their fortifications would protect them against God. God came upon them from where they least expected and put panic into their hearts. Their homes were destroyed by their own hands and the hands of the believers. Learn from this, all of you, with insight." So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says their homes were destroyed by their own hands, this is when the Banu Nadir were actually destroying their own homes with their own hands. Now this is almost the end of the first section of the Battle of Badr. Now, some of the lessons that we can take from this are that one of the things that the Prophet Muhammad was very, very an incredibly good leader, and what made him a good leader was that he listened to his counsel. He listened to the suggestions of other people. Even though he wanted to stay in Medina and fight in Medina, his council and the people around him, his parliament, if you will, suggested that they go out and fight. So he listened to him. It also showcases that the Prophet Muhammad knew how to fight in battle. He had strategic intelligence. Another thing that we can learn is the importance of listening to instructions. Now, it can be very, very difficult to listen to instructions sometimes, even though we might think we know what's better. But this story teaches us in all aspects of our lives that we should be obedient to other people's instructions. And especially the instructions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us in the Quran and Sunnah. Another thing we can learn is that Muslims stuck together and listened to the Prophet going forward. Meaning the archers, although they disobeyed the Prophet in the first instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did forgive them. So learn from your mistakes when you go forward. It's fine if you make mistakes, but learn from them as well. The other thing that we're going to learn more of now when we talk about the Battle of Khandaq is beware of hypocrites. There are people that do not have your best interests in heart, and you should take matters not in your own hands, because this we're talking about a political scenario, but we should be wary against people that might be there to harm us. Also, another thing to learn is that being on the truth, it doesn't guarantee being victorious. Although at this time, it was very difficult for the Muslims to understand why they lost. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has hikmah in everything. And there's khair in everything as well. And lastly, not to chase worldly possessions. Just like the archers, they saw the worldly possessions on the floor and chased them. Now let's move on to the battle of, some people call it Ahzab, Khandaq, Trench. They're all the same thing. So like I mentioned, Banu Nadir were exiled and forced to leave Medina. Now, one of the other tribes that also was forced to leave, and Banu Qaynuqa, they were forced to leave on a different premise. I'm not going to go into the story right now, but they committed a crime that was against the laws of Medina at the time. And this dispute led to their exile. Now, after Uhud, Banu Nadir and Banu Qaynuqa were exiled. Now, what ended up happening was Banu Nadir and Banu Qaynuqa, because they were also wanted revenge against the Prophet. They went to Quraysh in Mecca and they came to agreement, and then they said, let's attack the Muslims and end them once and for all. because the Quraysh did not completely end the Muslims, and they were not successful in killing the Prophet Muhammad. So both of these tribes went to Quraysh and they said, let's join forces together and let's go and attack the Muslims. So at this moment, the Quraysh gathered soldiers from the two Jewish tribes and a lot of Arab tribes that surround Mecca, and they went to attack the Muslim army. Now, an army of 10,000 in total set out to go towards. Now, when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ got word of this, that there was an army being built to come and destroy the Muslims, he again went to his council and he asked his council some advice. Now, again, the question was posed, shall we stay in Medina or should we go out and should we go and fight? Now, if you remember in Battle of Uhud, his council said, let's go out and fight. But this time round, Salman, a companion called Salman al-Farsi, who I suggest you go read his story because it's so incredibly interesting how he found Islam. He suggested that they stay in Medina, and when they stay in Medina, they should build a trench around the city. And the reason why he knew about this is because he had traveled a lot, and he had seen this tactic being used before. So he suggested that they build like a huge ditch around Medina to protect, to prevent the Quraysh from coming into the city. However, Medina was a big place, so they couldn't build a trench around the whole of the city like a circle. So I have a picture here. They built a trench around one of the sides of Medina. So you can see here where all the trees are. This is where Medina is, and the two grey areas are all field and like mountainous areas. So the Quraysh were not able to come through these ends, and the trench was built on one side of Medina, and on the south side of Medina there was a tribe called Banu Qurayza, and their population, their people were here. And the center of Medina where all the Muslims were. Now, Banu Qurayza, they had not been exiled, and they were still in joint forces with the Muslims. So the Muslims told Banu Qurayza that the Quraysh were going to come, and they needed to protect the south side from being entered from. Because if the Quraysh were able to enter from the south side, the same thing would have happened like it did in Uhud, and the Muslims would be sandwiched in between. And this is worse because the Masjid al-Nabawi is here, the families are here, all the possessions are here. If that was to happen, the Muslims would completely be eliminated. There would be no coming back from this. So Banu Qurayza were a key component in ensuring that the Quraysh did not come through an attack. Now, like we saw with the two other tribes, Banu Qurayza, although they were still outwardly supporting the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, they ended up betraying the Muslims. Now, you can imagine how the Muslims might be feeling when they got word that there might be a possibility that Banu Qurayza will break their treaty, because this means that everything that they worked hard towards, everything that they built so long, they migrated from Mecca and came to a new land, and all their possession, and then they had to start afresh, and then they did start afresh. All of that would be completely wasted. So they were feeling an incredibly amount of pressure. And one of the tribes that actually motivated Banu Qurayza to break their treaty with the Muslims and allow the Quraysh to come in was actually people from Banu Nadir. So Banu Nadir came and tried to reason with Banu Qurayza and convince them to allow this to happen. And if this happened, this would allow the Quraysh to be victorious. Now, what ended up happening was there was a man whose name was Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud. And Nu'aym ibn Mas'ud was an individual from Banu Qurayza who actually became Muslim. But he became Muslim secretly. So no one from his tribe actually knew they were Muslim yet. And what he did, he was an incredibly key player in dismantling this relationship Banu Qurayza had with the Quraysh. Now, when Nu'aym ibn Masud approached the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Nu'aym ibn Masud told the Prophet that he would plot and cause suspicion between the two sides, between Quraysh and Banu Qurayza. So what Nu'aym ibn Masud anhu, what he did was because no one knew he was Muslim yet, he went to Banu Qurayza and told them that, listen, Quraysh, they're not from us. They're not Jews like you. So if you betray the Prophet and the Quraysh get bored and don't actually go forward with the siege, they leave and they go back to Makkah just like they did in Uhud. That would leave Banu Qurayza in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hands. And if that happens, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is absolutely going to besiege you, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would avenge you because you've betrayed him. So you will be killed if Quraysh do not come and attack you, if they get bored from staying and waiting for the attack. This is what Nu'aym ibn Masud told the people of Banu Qurayza. So he said, but don't worry, what you should do is ask the Quraysh to give you 50 Quraysh leaders to stay with Banu Qurayza. That way you have some security that Quraysh are not just going to leave, and because Banu Qurayza have their leaders, and that will guarantee that the fight would actually go ahead. This is what Nu'aym ibn Masud told the Banu Qurayza. And Banu Qurayza listened to this and agreed to this and said, you know what, that makes sense. He's right. But at the same time, Nu'aym radiallahu anhu went to Abu Sufyan, who was leading the Quraysh at the time. And he said that Banu Qurayza made an agreement. This is what he is telling the Quraysh now. He's saying Banu Qurayza have made an agreement, a secret agreement with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to for the Banu Qurayza to take 50 Quraysh leaders and make peace with Banu Qurayza and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he told the Quraysh that Banu Qurayza are going to ask for 50 men because they are actually plotting with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that way they are going to take 50 of your leaders, and 50 of your leaders are going to go to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the next day, Abu Sufyan went to the leader of Banu Qurayza, who was Ka'b, and he said, when are we going to do the attack? And then Ka'b, just like Nu'aym ibn Masud said, he said, well, actually, for security reasons, we need you to give us 50 of your men to ensure that the fight will actually go ahead and you're not just going to go back to Mecca. But at the same time, Abu Sufyan thought, actually, they are asking for 50 of my men. That must mean that Nu'aym radiallahu anhu is correct. And they are plotting with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So at that moment, there was distrust that was formed. And Abu Sufyan said that they would not even give them one man. Thus, Nu'aym was successful in creating distrust between the two parties. And because of this, the Quraysh were not able to pass through the south side of Medina. Now, within the Battle of Trench, something I didn't mention was one of the things that the Muslims were going through was famine. They were going through an incredibly difficult time. Not just because of loss of food, because of loss of water. And imagine you're being trapped in your own city that you live in. And on top of that, you each man needs to be vigilant and needs to keep on the borders of their city, ensuring that no one passes the trench. Top of that, um, uh, on top of that, it was towards the end of the Battle of Trench, it was Ramadan as well. So the conditions of the Battle of Trench were incredibly difficult, and you read reports that this is some of the most difficult times of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, this plot from Quraysh and Banu Qurayza was dismantled, and then what ended up happening through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, a wind, almost like a sandstorm, came and lasted for a number of days. And because the weather conditions were so incredibly tough, a lot of the Quraysh were just fed up. They said, we're going to go back to Mecca. We don't want to stay here and wait for, some type of miracle for us to pass the trench. So a lot of the Quraysh actually went back home. And this is what ended the Battle of Trench. And this whole ordeal lasted for 20 days. And it took the Muslims around 6 days to build the actual trench. So the whole thing lasted for about a month. Now, after the Quraysh left to go back to Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad had to deal with the consequences of Banu Qurayza's betrayal. Because remember, Banu Qurayza were very close to betraying the Prophet Muhammad and he did the exact same thing that he did with Banu Nadir, and they were forced to surrender, and the Prophet Muhammad told them to leave their houses, and they were banished from their town. And this Battle of Khandaq is one of the most key moments where the Prophet Muhammad and the Muslims were incredibly victorious over the Quraysh, and also it showed that the Quraysh were unable to defeat the Muslims completely. Now, and I've written this here, the Quraysh had exerted their utmost strength to dislodge the Prophet Muhammad from Medina. And this defeat caused them to lose their trades with Syria and much of their prestige with it. At this point, Quraysh and the other non-residents of Mecca began to consider that conversion to Islam would be the most prudent option. So this is, without ruining the further points of the Seerah for you, this is almost the beginning of when even the Meccans and the non-Muslims in Mecca began to understand that the Muslims were a growing power, and politically the Muslims were ahead of the Quraysh, and that they were a real, not a threat, but they were a growing power. And a lot of Meccans at this point, after the Battle of Trench, decided to convert to Islam. And this is the beginning of the Muslims being victorious in many other battles as well. So that is, in a nutshell, the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Khandaq. Does anyone have any questions, or anything they would like to add, or anything that they know about the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Khandaq they'd like to share with us? Please do.